Hey guys, I'm here now to talk about some of the books that I have read recently outside of ShakeTube that I haven't talked about at all on this channel. I haven't even hauled them or revealed that I own them, so yeah, I just want to talk about them, give you my thoughts on them. First is Night Falls Fast, Understanding Suicide by Kay Redfield Jamison. Kay Redfield Jamison is famous for her memoir about her experiences with bipolar disorder. She has bipolar disorder, and she attempted suicide at one point in her life, and this is just her sort of scholarly account of suicide and risk factors for suicide. And she goes through many different aspects of suicide, from how it's been perceived historically. In some countries it was a crime, in other countries it was pretty normal, a normal part of the culture. She goes through how different methods for committing suicide, which is a bit of a strange chapter, places for committing suicide. She, of course, goes through different mental illnesses that put people at risk for committing suicide, like bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, and treatments for people who are at risk for suicide, different medications, and different therapies, and the condition of clinical practice at the moment, which she says is kind of there's a disparity between what studies show is the best kind of treatment and what the way practitioners actually treat people who are suicidal. And this entire book is depressing, but that in particular is very depressing, because it's a matter of life and death here. She also talks about an interesting chapter on evolutionary explanations for suicide, which is I've always been interested in evolutionary psychology, although I have quibbles with it. So she talks about how the sort of risky behavior that's associated with something like bipolar disorder probably was adaptive in humans' evolutionary past at some point, but it came along with the downside of committing suicide. But the fact that it in some instances was adaptive, like for example, she I think says someone who was manic might have been the first person ever to throw a spear at a woolly mammoth, for example. So that was maybe the way that these mental illnesses survived, was that they were adaptive in certain circumstances, but not always. So they sort of managed to sneak through our evolutionary history. So I found that pretty interesting. And she also has a chapter about people who know a loved one who committed suicide, which was particularly impactful for me because a very close friend of mine committed suicide earlier this year, so I was sort of dealing with that, and that was kind of my motivation for picking this book up, and also sort of my motivation for not really talking about it, because I felt uncomfortable talking about such personal issues on this channel. But that was my immediate motivation for picking this book up, although I'd been interested in learning more about suicide as a phenomenon for many years, just hadn't buckled down and picked up a book about it. So I'm glad I finally did that. I didn't learn anything terribly mind-blowing, but I think that that's mainly because I learned a lot about suicide and the risk factors for suicide in my undergraduate years, because I studied psychology. But definitely if you didn't study, or if you did study psychology, I still learned some things I didn't know, and she is really good at describing things in layman's terms. So if you didn't study psychology in undergraduate, this would certainly be a good place to go if you want to learn more about suicide. And she also intersperses each section of the book with an essay, which is basically her narrating the story of a person who committed suicide, and that really humanizes all of the studies and data she throws at you in the other sections. So I really liked it, and she's a great writer too, I think. There's that. Next is also along the same theme, A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, which is a memoir of the time after his wife died. His wife died of cancer, and he married her when he knew that she was going to die, but it obviously still hit him hard when she died. And this is just his exploration of grief as a process. And there were so many things that he said that I had been feeling or thinking after my friend died when I was grieving for him, that I didn't necessarily know how to put into words or necessarily understand. And he said it, and I was like, oh wow, I get that. For example, he talks about how we tend to idealize our loved ones when they die, and kind of turn them into saints, or into some abstraction of what they really were. And I found that really interesting. And he also talks about a lot of theological themes about how the death of his wife kind of tested his faith in God, because he thought, how could God let such a terrible thing happen? And those aren't always relatable to me, because I'm not religious, but I still get it. So I still found it interesting. Oh my. Sorry, the cat is going crazy. I don't know what is wrong with her, but so yeah, A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. And the last book I want to talk about is The New Trail of Tears: How Washington is Destroying American Indians by Naomi Schaefer Riley. So this is title is pretty self-explanatory. It's about the kind of current condition of Native Americans in the United States, and it's clearly pretty bleak. It's not a happy book. It's just occurred to me that all three of these are pretty depressing books. But I'm sorry, this is probably going to be a downer of a video, but so she goes through several different areas where basically the United States government is still screwing over Native Americans. We in American schools tend to learn, basically we learn about Native Americans up until the massacre at Wounded Knee, and then for all our education system cares, they fell off the side of the world. So she really tries to make an effort to give us an update on where they are right now, if we don't know through other places. I can't pretend to have understood all the nuances of the economics in this book, but the first part is about how Native Americans essentially don't own the land on the reservations they live on. A lot of it is held in trust by the United States government, and if it's very hard for Native Americans to get the private ownership of land to build on it, and for one thing, and for a second thing, they can't use their land as collateral to take out a loan to start businesses. And so what you get is, one, not very many private businesses and not very much economic activity as a result, and two, you get instances like one example I remember where there's a school on a reservation where enrollment has gone up, and rather than being able to build more buildings around the school, they have to just build more stories because they can't expand, because they don't have the right to. Basically Native Americans just don't own the land that's supposedly theirs to live on. And so you get, towns full of shacks and trailer parks, essentially. And and then the next section is about some Native American nations that actually have been able to attain some kind of economic prosperity, and a lot of it is through what Riley calls a loophole economy. So, for example, for a long time, cigarettes were not taxed, did not have the same taxes on reservations as they did outside. So Native American businesses could make a lot of money selling cigarettes because people would come to buy tax-free cigarettes on the reservation. From outside the reservation, they would come to buy cigarettes, and they could make a lot of money off of that. But eventually a lawsuit, of course, decided that this could no longer go on, and cigarettes started being taxed, and that was no longer a viable business That was no longer a way to make money. And she talks about casinos, especially among the Seneca in New York. I'm from upstate New York, and one of the main stereotype I remember hearing about Native Americans growing up is that they owned casinos. And, in upstate New York, there were a lot of Native Americans who owned casinos and got pretty wealthy off of it. But again, a lot of that was based on the fact that there was no competition. There were no casinos there weren't as many casinos outside of reservations. And so what's starting to happen now is that casinos are becoming more common off reservations, so people aren't coming to the casinos on reservations as much anymore. And those are just some examples. And so, painting a pretty bleak economic picture in terms of just people, making money and having employment. I mean, the employment rates that she talks about, the unemployment rates she talks about, and some of these reservations, I think it was something like 40-50%. So it's pretty crazy. And then she talks about schools. She does a long section about schools, and public schools on reservations are pretty terrible. They tend to graduate students just for the sake of graduating them, not because, even though they have Fs or something. She was in a public school. She was going through the school, interviewing this woman who worked there. And eventually, at one point, she was in a classroom with this woman, and the woman had to leave her for a second to help this kid with a math problem. And the woman who worked at this school, who talked to Naomi Schaefer Riley about improving the school system and improving education on the reservations, gave the kid she was helping the wrong way to solve a math problem. And it was just a simple arithmetic problem. And so that just seemed very sort of indicative of the education that these kids are getting in these reservation schools. And this is all despite the fact that she points out that the U.S. the funding for schools is very good, actually. Like, I think she says, for every Native American student in a school, the U.S. government spends like $20,000, as opposed to students off reservations where it's like $10,000 or $12,000. So she emphasizes that pumping more money into the reservation governments isn't what's going to help. And she also talks about some good schools, and unfortunately it seems like the best schools are private. These private Catholic schools, which have a bad reputation on reservations with good reason, because they were places where Native Americans were forcibly sent to be, Americanized. They were not allowed to speak their language. They had to take white names. They were often beaten, sexually abused. So these Catholic schools, with good reason, had very bad reputations. But a lot of them either got shut down and replaced by new ones, or they got reformed substantially. And she goes through these Catholic schools, which actually seem to do a very good job of not only educating kids, but of exposing them to their culture. A lot of these Catholic schools have events related to Native American culture and teach native languages. So I was surprised by that. But the only thing is that it would, of course, it would be ideal if the public schools could do all of this just as well. So yeah, and she talks about kind of the abuses that happen on reservations. So sexual abuse and child abuse is very common on Indian reservations, and she talks about adoption and how Native American nations are sort of so there's this law that allows Indian nations to dispute adoptions, so they can not allow a child to be adopted by a white family because it's an Indian kid, and they want it adopted by another Indian family to keep alive, Native American culture. And she points out how sometimes that leads to kids being kept in not great homes. So, yeah, this definitely is an eye-opening book. I knew Native Americans weren't doing well, but I didn't really know the details or just how bad. I maybe had some quibbles with this book. There are times where she seems to contradict herself a little bit. Like at one point she says that Native American parents complain that the schools give too much work or are too difficult, but then at another point she says that parents complain that the schools don't have high enough standards. And there's another point where she tries to dispel this myth that Native American cultures are all communalistic and didn't have an idea of private property. And I think that's great that she's dispelling that myth, because it is a myth. But she also kind of contradicts it a little bit later on when she talks about different tribes where there were these communalistic values. So, I don't know. That might just be me being too I don't know, particular. It also came throughout reading this book that I have a feeling that Naomi Schaefer Riley is a Republican, which is okay. Like, obviously, I still recommend this book highly, but that maybe came through and maybe colored my interpretation of what she said in not the greatest way. So, which isn't fair of me. So, that may have been the reason I was looking for these little quibbles, more so than that there's a huge flaw. But there definitely were times where I wish she'd gone into a bit more detail, where she said something that she just kind of seems to expect you to take take her word on, and yeah, and maybe sometimes where I also felt like maybe she was relying too much on anecdotal evidence, the sort of testimonies of individual administrators or workers, and not citing enough data. Sometimes she doesn't use concrete details to support her arguments. She kind of uses these abstract ideas about what's going on and what should happen, and rather than pointing out sort of individual instances or examples or data that support what she is trying to say and really would bring what she's arguing to life. But those being said, those criticisms may have just been colored by my liberal bias, but I still recommend this as just an eye-opener on how Native Americans are doing, and this is the only book of its kind I have heard anything about, so even if it has flaws, it I think would be good for everyone to read anyway. Yeah, anyway, those are the books that I have been reading outside of ShakeTube. Thank you for watching, everyone. I will see you sometime. I don't know, but bye!